This is the story of Bagan, Flight 011. It's Christmas Day 2012. At about 6:03 a.m. local time, a Fokker 100 jet with 65 people on board left Yangon International Airport to Mandalay International Airport for a short domestic flight in the country of Myanmar. Also, YouTube algorithm, don't demonetize me for the name of the plane. That's just what it's called. Not much I can do about it. Well, anyway, this was the first leg of the flight, and by 8:26 a.m. the second leg of the flight was underway. This leg took it from Mandalay International Airport to Heho International Airport. The plane quickly climbed to its cruising altitude of 13,000 feet, and within no time the jet was closing in on Heho. The pilots contacted Heho Center and they got the weather data for the airport that they would be landing at. It wasn't bad, to be honest. Calm winds, a bit of fog, and they had about 3 kilometers of visibility. As the jet descended, the radio altimeter came on, and the first officer called out, "Radio altimeter," to make it clear that the radio altimeter was working. As the plane went through 9,000 feet of altitude, the jet overflew the Heho NDB. The pilots would be performing a non-precision approach to runway 36 at the airport. The NDB approach needed the pilots to overfly the Heho NDB, and then they would have to turn to the right onto a heading of 220 degrees. After this was completed, they would then have to turn to the left onto a heading of 010 degrees. From that point on, they would just have to visually line up with the runway. The weather was a bit foggy, so the pilots decided to talk about the possibility of a go-around. As they talked about what they do in the event of a go-around, the jet started its turn to 220 degrees. The pilots had started the turn a little bit too soon, meaning that they were to the west of where they were supposed to be. But the captain saw the runway ahead of them and then decided to keep up with the approach. The captain saw that there was a bit of fog between them and the airport. It wasn't a big enough deal for there to be any cause for concern, so they decided to go ahead with the approach. The MDA, or the minimum descent altitude for Heho, was 530 feet. You have to remember that the MDA is doubly important because they were carrying out a non-precision approach. Had they been using an ILS or something like that, then under very specific conditions they would have been able to follow the radio beam all the way down to the runway. But with a non-precision approach, they did not have that luxury. As the Fokker dropped over the Myanmarian city of Heho, the pilots called eye visual as they spotted the runway. In the cockpit of the plane, the workload of the pilots started to pile up, as they now had to fly the plane, keep up with the radios, and a bunch of checklists to go through, and all of those things needed to be done before the plane got to the runway. As fog started enveloping the jet, the automated voice in the cockpit started counting down the altitude. The voice said 500, then 400, then 300, then 200. Then, when they were just 108 feet above the terrain, the captain realized that something was wrong. He just said, "Not okay." He might have seen something through the fog. The voice then called out 100, and then 50. In response, the pilots turned on the altitude hold setting on the autopilot. They knew that something was wrong and that this landing was going very wrong. But despite turning on the altitude hold button, the jet continued to descend. Then, a pair of power lines broke through the fog and the jet went right through those. Then the jet started striking trees. These impacts were so violent that they basically ripped the wings off the plane, and the tail detached and the plane caught on fire. 2 people did not make it out of this accident, 1 person on the ground and 1 person in the plane. So now the question is, how did a passenger plane that was supposed to land at an airport just minutes away end up flying through power lines and trees? The first thing that they looked at were the beacons that the pilots were using to get the plane on the ground, specifically the NDBs and the VORs that were in use at the time. You see, the beacons were malfunctioning, then it would explain why the plane came down well before the runway. But the beacons were working just fine. Then the attention shifted to the radio altimeter. The radio altimeter is used at low altitudes. It basically bounces a radio wave off of the terrain to figure out how high the plane is above the terrain. It's a very important instrument, and in the conditions that the pilots found themselves in, it would have been indispensable. So, did it fail? No, that too checked out. The data that the pilots were getting from the plane was rock solid, and they saw no reason as to why the plane flew into the ground on final approach. They then listened to the CVR, and then they found a crew that was not all the way there. In the case of a non-precision approach, especially in bad weather, you're supposed to keep the runway in sight as much as you can. If you lose the runway, you go around. As simple as that. But in this case, the pilots knew that they had some fog between them and the runway, and they went into the fog bank and they lost sight of the runway. But even when that happened, they did nothing. That is why the MDA is present. It's there to prevent you from descending below a minimum safe altitude. But in the case of Bagan Flight 011, The pilots just breezed through the MDA without even a call out. Usually, both pilots would verbally agree that they had the runway in sight and that they were continuing with the approach. But in this case, there was none of that. The realization that something was wrong only hit them when they were 100 feet off the ground. But even then, they did not initiate a go-around. The only thing that they tried to do was try and hold the altitude, which personally I do not get. There might be terrain in the area, there might be obstacles, you're well below the minimum descent altitude by hundreds of feet, and you decide to hold the altitude instead of just going around and trying again? That just does not make sense. This was a textbook case of a plane that should have gone around, but the pilots did not do that. They were in clear violation of the standard operating procedure of Air Bagan. The report doesn't really go into why the pilots did what they did, but it does give us 4 theories on why the pilots kept descending. The first theory is the one that we're all thinking. They got into the fog bank and then just kept descending without any regard for where they were. The second theory is that they were trying to conduct a constant angle approach, which meant that they were trying to get to the runway by descending at a predictable, controlled angle. And then they just lost track of where they were while they were trying to do that. The third theory is that the captain got distracted by other airplanes approaching runway 36 and then blowing through the MDA while he was on the radio with the controllers. And lastly, theory 4 is that the crew are trying to descend to the MDA as fast as possible so that they could establish a visual on the ground and then just kept on descending. It also must be noted that the pilots were under a high workload when all of this was happening, and the high workload probably just exacerbated what was already wrong in the cockpit. Which theory do you think happened in the cockpit of Flight 011? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. But all of that being said, the pilots still failed to realize the danger that they were in and then flew the plane into the ground. It would have been easy for the investigators to stop here and be like, hey, the pilots messed up, let's move on. But then they turned their attention to the airline, Air Bagan, to see how they train their pilots. The airline was founded in 2004, and in the grand scheme of things, it was tiny. They had 2 Fokker F-100s, 2 ATR-72s, 2 ATR-42s, and 38 pilots on its roster. Looking into the history of the training received by the pilots, they found out that the pilots had not gotten a whole lot of simulator training when it came to responding to GPWS warnings. For those of you that don't know, a GPWS warning is when the plane sends out an oral warning, like too low terrain, or pull up, something like that, and in that case, you're supposed to go around, no questions asked. The pilots of Air Bagan were never trained like this, and that might just explain their nonchalant response to them being well below the MDA. Any well-trained pilot would have recognized that they were in a place that they should not have been and would have gone around, but these guys did not, and that made all the difference when it came down to the safety of Flight 011. Maybe since they didn't have training, the alarm caught the pilots really offhand, and they just didn't know what to do with the warning. They had never been taught to respond to the warning, and so they might have just frozen up. Also, in addition to all of this, the investigators found that the pilots needed a lot more training when it came to CFIT, or controlled flight into terrain prevention. It's no surprise that this plane flew into the ground, to be honest. It was just a matter of time with how the airline was being run. The airline ceased operations in 2018, and there are no plans right now to revive the airline. Who knows, maybe that's a good thing, to be honest. If it were not for the quick reaction of the firefighters and the locals that were near the crash site, then this crash definitely would have been much worse. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.